All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This was originally going to be a different stream about some different stuff, but I've moved things around a little bit. So be sure to go to our website, isoc-nc.org, in order to see the latest schedule. I've been kind of shifting things around because the news has been changing quite a lot. So if you do go to our website, you'll see that we're doing a special follow-up about the internet situation in Cameroon, which is sort of developing. And then later on, I'll also be doing a program where I talk about how I do my research for these little videos, these little live streams that I'm doing, and kind of give you an idea of how I navigate the world of tech news. So that should be a lot of fun. That'll be in a couple of weeks. And then I have another one I want to do on IPv6 and why I think it's terrible. Which keeps getting bumped and bumped and bumped further. So if you're really excited about hearing me bash on IPv6, you're going to have to wait a couple of weeks for that. But it's going to be a good one too. So let's talk about this one, and that is the follow-up to the basically the Senate overview of the FCC, or rather the Senate was looking at the oversight of the FCC. So they had an opportunity to ask questions and interact with some of the people at the FCC, including Ajit Pai, who, just to reiterate, he was appointed in January, and he was originally appointed by Barack Obama back in 2012, but then his term came up in July 1st in 2016. So Trump renewed his appointment, so it's kind of retroactive back to July 1st, 2016, and then that'll be effective for 5 years. But he didn't become the actual commissioner until January. So that happened. That was a precursor. That was sort of the setup to the event. A couple of things that we learned in that. It looks like the AT&T and Time-Warner merger, the FCC is not going to do anything about that. They're not going to touch it unless they have to. Their position is that the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, should take charge instead, since it feels like it's under their purview, because unless any sort of FCC licenses are being swapped or traded, he says it's not under their purview to do anything about that. And then, of course, the Justice Department is going to look at antitrust complications that would be involved in that. Of course, I'm very skeptical about any antitrust legislation. I don't think it's been terribly effective the past few decades. So we'll see about that. That's definitely something that I don't think that anybody thinks that our media should be more consolidated than it already is. So we'll see about that. But he says that the FCC is not going to touch it. So probably nothing else to talk about with respect to that going forward. If he says that they're not going to even look at it or even investigate it, then if you're interested in that issue, then you're probably going to have to look in a different direction. They did ask that he do an investigation to see whether or not the FCC should be investigating it or should be a part of it, and he agreed to do that investigation, basically to have somebody look into whether or not the FCC is actually obligated to do anything with respect to that merger. So, but we'll see. One of the things that you mentioned that sort of disturbed me was the issue of local media consolidation. So previously it was illegal. It was not acceptable. It was regulated against, to use the nice technical terms, for, say, in a small town, for someone to own, the local TV stations, the local newspapers, the local everything. Basically, you couldn't. They could, all of the media couldn't come from one company. And he said that he didn't find any evidence that that was a problem. I don't know how I feel about that. Um, you know, he says there's no evidence that that's a problem, but um, you know, how many situations or have there actually been to look at, to examine that, to see what effect that has on those kinds of communities that only have one company uh, to that provides all of their sources of information, or all of their information comes from the same media outlet. I don't think there are enough examples to say either way. I think it's a little bit premature to jump the gun and say that isn't going to cause issues, or that just because it doesn't cause issues in these certain cases, it wouldn't cause issues anywhere. I can tell you that there's lots of places, that already exist in their own little world, and it would really just get even worse if all the media was owned by one company. So I'm a little concerned about that. Not too happy about that. But we'll see. Again, if you protect the internet and you increase internet access, then all of this is meaningless, right? That's not even internet related. But it was a little bit concerning. But, again, if we can get internet access to these places and lots of different providers and lots of different options for connecting to the internet, I don't really care if they only have one TV channel, right? But that's me. That's my personal opinion. So it still worries me a little bit, because there are places where that's where they get all their information. So if it's consolidated, the same local TV station also owns the newspaper, and that's all that's available in that area. I don't like that. I don't like the sound of that. But anyway, what else? I wish that there had been more, honestly. I scheduled this, and I thought that I was going to have a lot to talk about, and I really don't, because the senators just were acting like lunatics as usual. Anytime you have it's crazy because it's a bit of a conundrum, right? I like open sessions. I like when the public has access to view these discussions and to view these interactions and see what questions were asked and what the actual answers were, and to look at everything in context and get the full transcripts and stuff. I really like that, right? But when you put politicians in that particular situation, they tend to act a little bit nutty, like they act a little bit crazy. They can't, negotiate. They can't act like they're uncertain about something. They can't really ask questions where it looks like they're confused or they want clarification. It's like, oh, I didn't understand that last point. Could you clarify that to me? That will kill them as a politician, right? And so they end up acting a little bit loopy. They end up acting kind of nutty and asking crazy questions, and they turn it into this big political thing. So, whereas behind closed doors, or when you're talking to them one-on-one, they seem very reasonable. You're like, oh, you seem like a pretty reasonable person. I feel like we could have a lot in common. And then they get in front of a TV camera, and it's just, they go crazy. But anyway, so it wasn't as useful as I was hoping it would be. There was just a lot of just nonsense. But let's see. Let's look at some of the other points. Probably the biggest one are the privacy rules for ISPs. So what had happened was, to use a Southern phrase, what had happened was that there was a set of regulations passed saying that basically there were 2 points. The first was that they had to have security measures. ISPs had to have security measures in place to protect users' data. And that was supposed to take effect, I don't remember, sometime later this year, something about mid-year. And it was supposed to be about, what kinds of things have to be in place in order to protect users' data from, so if there was a breach or a hack at the ISP, to make sure that they weren't storing data that could be stolen by hackers and stuff like that. That's good. The other one was that it was going to require ISPs, if an ISP wanted to collect data about your web search history, if they wanted to collect data about what websites you went to, what things you purchased, what what applications you use, what what your interests are in your Google searches and stuff like that, then they would be required to opt in. In other words, they would require an opt-in from you. You would have to opt into that. So sometimes you go to a website and it says, if you agree to allow us to use your data and sell your data to advertisers, click yes, right? And you can opt in or out. They were going to require that of ISPs. So the big deal with that is both of those things are out the window. Both those things are gone. And their argument for that is that the FTC, once again, it looks like they're kind of shoving it off on the FTC and saying that the FCC rules that already exist to cover that that kind of stuff should apply to the ISPs, rather than the FCC creating its own set of rules and applying it. You know, which is fine. I was looking at the FTC rules today, actually, and I think I understand why there's a pushback against that, because, you know, this is sort of its own thing, and I feel like maybe we need separate rules for the internet a little bit, because you're talking about different kinds of data that's being gathered. But let's see, that's probably the big one, is where the privacy rules, and the argument from the ISPs was that, well, Google gathers all that data from you without asking. You know, they say, if you want to use our service, this is how they do it. They do ask. They say, if you want to continue to use Google, then you agree to this big list of terms that no one ever reads, right? And the same thing with Apple, and the same thing with Amazon, and the same thing with all these other companies. So they make this big list, and they say, you cannot use our software unless you agree to these terms, and these terms allow us to gather information from you and sell all your data. That's a gross generalization. Some companies are a little bit better about it. Google's really transparent about the, about what they gather. They do gather a lot of really creepy stuff, but they'll tell you, you know, if you go to their privacy page, they'll tell you exactly what they gather. And there are options for, you know, there are some services where you can still use the service, and they agree not to, they can have you opt out of it or whatever. But that's the ISP's argument, that, you know, all these other internet companies are making all this money selling directed advertisement based on this data, so why can't they do it? And my answer to that would be that, for now anyway, there's still a lot of competition when it comes to internet services like Google or Amazon. You can always choose to go shop someplace else or use a different search engine. But again, if we go back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago, a lot of places, they only have one option for an ISP. I feel like if ISP competition was a lot higher, then there would be a lot less opposition to these sorts of things, because then people would actually have a choice. Of course, a lot of people, including myself, are opposed to the amount of data that's being gathered by companies like Google. And this sort of, because, you know, they're so big, it's the idea that you just don't use Facebook. Like, how practical is that really in the modern age? I've managed to avoid it for the most part. I am on Facebook, but I have just about everything turned off. But you can kind of understand why people would see that it's not such a great answer, or the idea of not using Google. It's like so many services require you to. So many aspects of our life, you know, you'll eventually have to have a Facebook page, or someone will say, you know, you have to go to Google Docs and work on this document with me. What's your choice think, you know? So I'm sort of opposed to even those companies gathering as much information as they do. I don't think they're doing anything sinister with it. I think they're literally just selling it and using it to use targeted advertisements, but it's a huge risk that all of that data is floating out there, easily accessible to anyone who can figure out the latest security flaw. So I think I think some rules need to be in place to make certain that what data they're gathering is relevant to their business, that people have control over whether or not that's shared in the first place, I think people should opt into it rather than have to opt out of it, because most people are just brainless most of the time. stuff like that. Like I'm very much in favor of trying to protect the user in that respect. So I don't think that the argument from the ISPs that, well, these other guys are doing it, I don't think that's a good argument, because I don't really think those guys should be doing it either. But that's just me again. In terms of this, like I said, they're just basically saying that the FTC rules should apply to everybody. And we'll see whether or not that actually pans out, or if that has the effect that we want to see, which is that ultimately people have control over what data is gathered about them and how it's used. Because the moment that that you give up all this personal information, and I'll just go ahead and kind of put it out there. Like, I'm not really worried about Google doing something bad with your personal information, or Comcast. They're looking at your search history. They're looking at your search history to try to find out what size shoe you wear, so they can advertise, right? But the moment that they have that data and they've got it somewhere and they're storing it, that's data about you as a person, right? And the idea of being able to be anonymous on the internet, not at all times, but when you want to, when you need to, is really, really important to me. So if somebody's poking through your search history, and I'm not just talking about what you're thinking about, I mean anything, right? Like you have personal thoughts and questions, and you wonder things about the world, and you should be able to explore that, particularly on the internet, judgment-free and without the repercussions of, society crashing down on you. So, and so you open up the possibility of third parties, like the government, for example, or businesses who oftentimes have non-profit related agendas to attack people. So, anyway, that's my speech. But this was all sort of prompted by the fact that the Internet Society was involved in a lot of these discussions. They sent the North American Director of Chapters, who we have a meeting with once a month. They sent him to Capitol Hill last week, I think, and then he met with us, and we did a follow-up, and we asked him a bunch of questions about what went on, and he was very optimistic about what was going to happen, especially in terms of, there's so many billions of dollars that are supposed to be going to rural broadband development. But we'll have to see. We'll have to find out whether or not whether it's really going to happen. If it is, I'm going to try to get as much of it as I can and get it here in North Carolina. But, we'll have to see how that plays out. I'm cautiously optimistic. And that's his optimism feeding into me. That's not a natural state for me to be optimistic. But he seemed very optimistic that it wasn't just going to be a handout to the ISPs, that it actually was going to be able to be used. And I hope that that's the case. And if it is, then it'll be a very good year for the chapter. So, very busy year. Let's see. I don't have any little fun graphics today. So I think we'll just go ahead and call it right there. Like I said, I didn't have as much to talk about as I thought I would. So then next week we'll be looking at some other things. I think probably the Cameroon situation, and then we'll continue on from there. Obviously, if you have anything that you would like to know, or that you would like for me to do a live stream on, I can always do research for you. A lot of this stuff, and I'm going to talk about this in my live stream in a couple of weeks. A lot of the information that I have comes from the Internet Society and sort of inside sources, which makes it sound far more dramatic than it really is, I promise you. But basically, people who are a little bit closer, they work with this stuff every single day, right? And so their ear is a little bit closer to the ground when it comes to what's going on. And I try to get it as, siphon out the rumors and stuff as much as I can. So if you have any questions about anything that's going on, or you want to know details about what's going on, I either probably know, or I can find out. I know a lot of other stuff did happen during the session, So if you're interested in any of that, we can talk about it as well. Or if you just hate me and all of my opinions, you can leave a comment and we can argue about it. But either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.